Let's talk about how a single, forgotten cell phone and a messy web of text messages absolutely cracked a deadly true crime case. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating piece of Philippine jurisprudence. It's the 2014 Supreme Court case of People versus Enojas, GR No. 204894. This case is a brilliant, real-world example of what happens when modern digital communication crashes headfirst into the gritty reality of street crime and, of course, the strict rules of our legal system. We're going to see exactly how investigators used just one digital breadcrumb to completely unravel a syndicate, and how the Supreme Court ended up evaluating that digital evidence.
So picture the dark streets of Las Piñas. It's August 29, 2006, right around 10:30 p.m. Police officers Eduardo Gregorio Jr. and Francisco Pangilinan are out conducting a totally routine patrol near the Toyota Alabang and SM South Mall area. Suddenly, they spot a taxi. Now, this taxi is parked highly suspiciously right in front of an auto glass shop near a major intersection. So the officers walk up and ask the driver, a guy named Enojas, to present his documents. He complies, but right away the officers have some serious doubts about the veracity of the papers he handed over. Things just aren't adding up. Deciding they need to dig a little deeper, they ask Enojas to come with them to the police station for some questioning. And what started as a totally routine check is about to turn deadly.
The sequence of events here escalates so rapidly. At 10:30 p.m., the police are questioning Enojas, but instead of cooperating, just 5 minutes later, at 10:35, he suddenly makes a run for it. He flees right in the middle of the commotion, literally leaving his taxi completely behind. And then, at 10:40 p.m., just shortly after he bolts, a fatal shootout erupts. Tragically, PO2 Pangilinan is killed in a gunfight by armed men in the vicinity. By 11 a.m., as the dust finally settles and police backup arrives, investigators start searching that abandoned taxi. And right there, left behind on the seat, they find the ultimate game changer, Enojas' mobile phone.
Which brings us to the digital sting operation.
Now here's how the police masterminded an absolute trap. The chief of the investigation division tells police officer 3 Joel Camby to immediately start monitoring the incoming messages on that abandoned phone. Camby realizes the phone is actively blowing up with texts from other members of the group, and he does something incredibly clever. He actually poses as Enojas. He just starts replying to the text messages, communicating directly with the co-accused like nothing happened. Through this digital disguise, the police set up a full-blown entrapment operation. This text message sting directly resulted in the arrest of 2 co-accused, Fernando Santos and Roger Jolandoni, and eventually led right to the capture of Enojas himself, along with another man named Arnold Gomez.
Now let's head into the courtroom battle.
All of this brings us to a massive constitutional question. Can the police actually use your text messages against you in court? The defense pushed back hard on this. They argued vehemently that the text messages should be totally inadmissible because they weren't properly identified. They basically claimed, hey, you can't just bring a phone into a courtroom and start reading texts out loud. There has to be a strict legal foundation. And honestly, this posed a major evidentiary challenge for the prosecution.
Let's unpack the electronic evidence rule.
To demystify how the law works here, we really need to look at how it classifies SMS messages. Under the rules on electronic evidence, text messages fall under this category called ephemeral electronic communication. I know it sounds super technical, but this legal jargon essentially just refers to telephone conversations, text messages, and other electronic forms of communication where the evidence isn't traditionally recorded or permanently retained in a physical document. Because they're so fleeting, the law actually has very specific rules on exactly how they must be authenticated in front of a judge.
And this legal framework brilliantly illustrates why the evidence was ultimately ruled admissible. The rule actually states, ephemeral electronic communications shall be proven by the testimony of a person who was a party to the same or has personal knowledge thereof. So think back to our sting operation for a second. Who was actually texting the suspects? It wasn't Enos, it was PO3 Camby. Because PO3 Camby personally sent and received those sting messages while pretending to be Enos, he was legally a party to the conversation. He had direct, personal knowledge of the messages. Therefore, he was perfectly 100% competent to testify about their contents in court. Problem solved.
Next up, connecting the circumstances.
Now we see how the prosecution built an airtight case. What's really fascinating here is how the totality of all this circumstantial evidence collectively proved guilt. You see, the Supreme Court noted that circumstantial evidence is totally sufficient for a conviction as long as the combination of all the circumstances produces conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. It's like a giant puzzle. Just look at the facts. First, Enojas fled his taxi rather than go to the station. That definitely shows he had something to hide.
Second, another officer positively identified Gomez running away from the scene of the shooting. Third, the text messages on the abandoned phone explicitly referenced the shootout and even mentioned a wounded gunman named Quad Justin, who actually later died in a hospital. And finally, the clincher, when the suspects were arrested during the entrapment, they were carrying the exact mobile phones with the call numbers that corresponded to the senders of the messages. The context of these texts showed they were an organized group engaged in illegal activities. The whole web was just undeniably airtight.
Let's look at the final verdict. So the lower courts originally convicted the men of murder, but the Supreme Court actually modified this. Why? Well, it comes down to the legal definition of murder, which requires evident premeditation. Basically, that means proof that the criminals deliberately planned the killing beforehand. The prosecution definitely proved they were involved in the shootout, but they just didn't prove the group planned to kill the officer prior to that sudden, chaotic encounter. Because of that missing element, the Supreme Court downgraded the crime to homicide. However, they didn't let them off easy. They applied a special aggravating circumstance because the group used unlicensed firearms during the deadly shootout, which ensured the punishment remained incredibly severe.
Ultimately, for the crime of homicide aggravated by the use of those unlicensed firearms, the Supreme Court sentenced each of the accused to a minimum of 12 years of prison mayor, all the way up to a maximum of 20 years of reclusion temporelle in prison. Plus, they had to pay various civil damages to the heirs of the fallen officer.
And that brings us to our final takeaway. This case is a stark reminder of how rapidly the law has had to adapt to modern technology. A dangerous syndicate was unraveled not just by footprints left on the pavement, but by digital footprints zipping through cellular towers. So, in an age where our phones literally never leave our sides, what digital footprints are you leaving behind? It's kind of a provocative thought, right? It reminds us that technology intersects with the law every single day, often in ways we don't even realize until it's presented as evidence in a courtroom. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep your curiosity sharp.